peasant diets, and gruel for days. It began each morning with the same sound, the creaking of the wooden door, the wind slipping through cracks in the wattle walls, and the low gurgle of a pot on the fire. Inside, a medieval peasant's home was never truly warm, never truly still. The fire in the hearth sputtered softly, heating a small iron cauldron filled with the same meal it had held the night before. A thin, grayish porridge made of barley or oats, stirred slowly with a wooden spoon, worn smooth by generations of hunger. This was breakfast, and it would be lunch, and sometimes it would be dinner too. The medieval diet for most people was not one of choice, but of survival. Meals weren't prepared with flavor in mind, but with the quiet hope of simply enduring another day. The average person in medieval Europe, a tenant farmer, a laborer, a mother trying to feed her children on scraps, had little access to meat, almost no spices, and only the changing seasons to guide what could grow in a small garden plot. Barley and rye were the most dependable crops. Wheat was rare and expensive, usually reserved for the wealthier households and monasteries. So, the commoners made do with what they had, grains that could be dried, boiled, ground, and formed into heavy loaves of bread, or simmered endlessly into a kind of edible sludge. Pottage, they called it, a stew of whatever was left over. Cabbage leaves, leeks, dried peas, the occasional root vegetable, if they were lucky. Sometimes it had flavor, sometimes it didn't. But it filled the belly, and that was enough. The bread was thick, often dark, and rarely fresh. A crust so coarse it could cut the gums, and a center so dense it sat in the stomach like stone. It wasn't uncommon for flour to be mixed with acorns, beans, or even sawdust to make it stretch further, an adulteration born not from greed, but desperation. Millers and bakers were often tempted to extend their product just a little more. In a world where hunger sat at the table each day, the line between food and filler blurred. Milk was a seasonal indulgence, fresh only when the animals were well and grazing. Eggs came sparingly, guarded carefully by hens that might stop laying altogether in the coldest months. Butter was precious. Cheese, when it could be made, was hard and dry, meant to last, not to delight. Water, even when clean, was seldom trusted. Ale, brewed weak, was a more common drink, not because it intoxicated, but because the brewing process made it safer to consume. Children drank it, old men drank it. It was the closest thing they had to hydration that didn't make them ill. And yet, amidst this sameness, there was rhythm, a kind of sacred repetition that structured life. Certain vegetables would emerge in the spring: nettles, sorrel, wild onions. In summer, there might be beans or apples if the tree had survived the frost. Autumn was a season of quiet celebration, when mushrooms could be foraged, when root vegetables were stored away in cellars, and dried fruits hung from rafters like tiny promises of sweetness in the dark winter to come. But even those pleasures were brief. Winter returned quickly, and it stayed. It came with wind and wet earth, with mold creeping into the stores, and rats gnawing at the corners of the pantry. The fire might warm the hands, but it never reached the toes, and the pottage never thickened into satisfaction. It just boiled, thinner and thinner, until the pot was scraped clean with the back of a spoon. There were no cookbooks for the poor, no written recipes to pass down. Everything was done by memory, by feel, by hunger. Mothers taught daughters not how to season a dish, but how to stretch a handful of grain over 3 days, how to know if an egg was still good, how to hide a bit of fat from the last pig slaughter in the bottom of the cupboard. Sometimes a neighbor might share a small handful of herbs, sage, thyme, maybe some garlic. But these were luxuries. Food was not meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to keep the body from falling apart. Children grew slowly. Many were stunted. Malnutrition left its mark in hollow cheeks, bowed legs, and brittle teeth. And still they played. Still they laughed in the mud and chased geese through the fields. Hunger for them was a kind of background hum. It was always there, but it did not always stop life from being lived. Feast days were rare, but remembered. A wedding might bring roasted meat to the village square, pork or goose, dripping with its own fat. A holiday might mean a honey cake or a sip of something stronger than ale. For a single evening, food could become joy. But it passed quickly, and the next morning brought back the porridge. Peasants rarely wrote about food, but in the margins of records, in the oral stories passed through the years, there are glimpses, small laments about a spoiled loaf, quiet pride over a good crop of onions, sorrow over a failed harvest. The diet was meager, but it carried them. And sometimes, when the moon hung low over the village and the fire crackled just right, that same porridge could taste like survival. In a world ruled by hunger, even a bowl of gruel had its place. But what happened when that bowl wasn't enough? When the fields failed and the stores went bare? Let's turn now to the quiet desperation of a season without harvest. The spice trade, a dream for rich people. There was once a time when a single pound of nutmeg could buy you 7 fat oxen. That wasn't a metaphor or exaggeration. It was the strange, pungent truth of the Middle Ages. In a world where most people had never tasted a lemon or seen a peppercorn. The idea of spices was something closer to magic than cuisine. Spices didn't just season food. They whispered of faraway lands, of danger and gold, of ships on distant seas, and men who vanished on the Silk Road with silk in one hand and cinnamon in the other. For the average medieval peasant, spices were not just expensive, they were mythical. You could live an entire life and never taste black pepper. You could die without ever knowing what cinnamon smelled like. Ginger, cloves, nutmeg. These weren't kitchen staples. They were treasure. And so, while common people boiled their cabbage in garlic water and stirred vinegar into their pottage, the nobility dined in halls filled with unfamiliar fragrances. Their cooks crushed spices with stone mortars and blended them into sweet and savory sauces, dusted meat pies with saffron, and stirred almond milk with cardamom. The food sparkled, not with nutrition, but with excess. And every grain of spice that fell to the floor was worth more than the shoes worn by the servant who swept it away. But those spices had to come from somewhere. They didn't grow in England's rainy gardens or Germany's forest glades. They were brought, one careful step at a time, from the edge of the known world. It began in places like India, Sri Lanka, and the islands of Indonesia, where trees bore bark that became cinnamon, and flowering plants gave birth to cardamom pods. Arab merchants would collect these goods at ports buzzing with color and heat, then carry them westward across deserts and seas, passing them from hand to hand like prayers. They traveled in caravans, sometimes for months at a time, guided by stars and guarded by hired swords. Eventually, these spices reached the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa, Alexandria, and there, in the silent backrooms of counting houses and merchant halls, their price doubled, and then tripled. By the time they reached the table of a French baron or an English earl, their journey had become invisible. All that remained was the taste, and even that was limited to the elite. Meanwhile, the peasant scraped burnt bits from a wooden spoon and seasoned stew with wild mustard, if they could find any. Vinegar stood in for citrus, and strong-smelling herbs, garlic, horseradish, and wild onion, did what they could to distract from the blandness beneath. This gap in flavor mirrored the gap in everything else: status, land, power. A noble's plate was as distant from a peasant's bowl as his castle was from their hut, and the spices only deepened that distance. There were laws, too, sumptuary rules, that restricted who could buy certain ingredients, including spices. Even if a farmer struck it lucky and had silver to spare, he might not be allowed to buy cinnamon. It wasn't just rare. It was reserved. Still, the fascination with spices trickled down. Recipes written by monks or royal scribes mentioned them casually, as if they were available in every pantry. And sometimes, in the quiet corners of the world, a bit of clove or anise would make its way to a village festival. A merchant's generosity, or a church's feast day, might allow one miraculous taste. It didn't last, but the memory did. And then, there were those who chased these flavors for a living. Spice traders, men like Giovanni de Marinoli, left behind comfort and kin to sail across uncharted waters and ride through desert winds. Many never returned. Some were robbed, others starved or succumbed to illness on the road. But for a few, fortune smiled. They returned home with holds filled with precious cargo, their hands stained by saffron and sweat. Their names were spoken in awe, their wealth counted in cloves and peppercorns. The spice trade was not just about food. It was about status and empire and risk. And behind every noble's banquet filled with jeweled sauces and golden seasonings stood hundreds of hands that had picked, packed, and passed those flavors through danger and distance. And still, at the bottom of the hill, the village simmered its leeks and barley, tasting the air, but never the spice. Even now, if you open your spice drawer, you hold a history of longing. Cinnamon once rode camels across Persia. Nutmeg once sank with ships off the coast of Sumatra. Peppercorns once paid rent for entire city blocks. It is strange to think that what was once worth a kingdom now sits forgotten at the back of a pantry. But what if you had never tasted any of it? What if the only flavor you knew was hunger? In the next chapter, we return to the fields, where food came and went with the weather, and even vegetables were a seasonal miracle. Fruit and vegetables, seasonal, scarce, and sad. The wind whispered through the hedgerows, and the frost lingered long into spring. In the little village, plots behind wattle fences and thatched roofs, green shoots sometimes dared to appear, a cabbage curled tightly against the cold, a stringy onion half buried in the soil. These were not abundant gardens, bursting with color. They were modest, careful, and slow, like everything else in a peasant's world. Fruits and vegetables in medieval times were not always part of a daily meal. They were guests, not residents, arriving with the seasons and disappearing just as quickly. When they were there, they were eaten quickly, without ceremony. There was no long-term storing of fresh strawberries or soft figs. You ate what ripened, when it ripened, or you watched it rot. In spring, the first greens were often bitter. Nettles, sorrel, wild mustard leaves. These were gathered from the hedges and fields, washed in cold water, and boiled into pottage. Not because they were liked, but because they were there. After a long winter of dried grains and preserved roots, even bitter things felt alive. Summer brought more hope. Peas and beans grew in rows behind cottages, sometimes trained on makeshift trellises made from old branches. If the weather was kind, and the soil not too tired, there might even be cucumbers or leeks. But each year was a gamble. A sudden storm could flatten the garden. A hot drought could kill it. Fruits were rarer still. Apples and pears hung on a few lucky trees, guarded carefully by children with sticks and watchful eyes. Berries, blackberries, gooseberries, elderberries, grew wild along the village paths and were picked quickly before birds could take them. These small fruits weren't eaten for pleasure. They were turned into pastes, boiled into preserves, dried if possible. A sweet apple might be sliced thin and left on a cloth to dry in the sun, becoming leathery and tough, but still a reminder of summer in the dead of winter. Vegetables had no special names or colors then. No one spoke of heirloom tomatoes or organic kale. There were no carrots in rainbow shades, no salad mixes in wooden bowls. A medieval carrot was likely pale, thin, and bitter. A lettuce, if it could be found, was not crisp and cool, but soft and weedy. Most people had never even seen a tomato. It wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries, nor would potatoes or corn or peppers. The vegetables we take for granted today had not yet crossed the ocean. And so, they ate what they had: turnips, beets, cabbages, strong, earthy plants that could withstand a few insults from the weather. They were boiled, usually, into submission. Rarely roasted, never spiced. A carrot might be added to a pot of barley gruel. An onion might be the only seasoning in a meal for days. Preservation was its own form of magic. Root cellars held what could be kept: cabbages buried in straw, apples stored in barrels, onions hung from the beams to dry slowly over the fire. Pickling became a form of survival. Cucumber slices in vinegar, onions soaked in brine. Sauerkraut, shredded cabbage, fermented until sour and pungent, became a small miracle of longevity. These preserved vegetables were precious, not for their flavor, but for their presence when the snow returned and the ground refused to yield. But even these small efforts had limits. Most peasant homes did not have glass jars, or large barrels, or enough vinegar to preserve the entire harvest. When something rotted, it was thrown away. And when something grew mold before it could be eaten, It was scraped off and eaten anyway. The hunger never left. Even in harvest months, it lingered at the edges, watching, waiting. A failed crop could mean a lean winter. 2 failed crops could mean death. Children learned to identify edible weeds from their mothers. Men foraged for mushrooms, risking poison for a better meal. Berries were sometimes stolen from monastery gardens. A single turnip, taken from a noble's field, might mean punishment. In the monastic cloisters, things were different. The monks kept tidy gardens, herbs for medicine, fruits for preserves, vegetables for their own tables. They experimented with irrigation, crop rotation, and careful grafting. These gardens were sanctuaries of order and quiet abundance. But they were not shared freely. For most peasants, the idea of a steady supply of fruits and vegetables was a fantasy. A pottage made with cabbage was nourishing. A dish with leeks and garlic was a feast. A single apple, given to a child, became a memory. They lived season to season, trusting the rhythms of the earth more than the promises of kings. And when winter returned, they ate the last shriveled onions, the final bits of dried fruit, and then went without. Still, they survived. Somehow, they found ways to coax life from poor soil, to hold flavor in vinegar and salt, and to eat the same cabbage 50 different ways without losing hope. But what of meat? What of the rich, fatty comfort that so rarely appeared in their bowls? The next tale follows the scent of a feast that rarely arrived, and the long, uneasy silence it left behind. Meat, rare, tough, and occasionally stolen. There was a smell that traveled differently through the village. Rich and smoky, it curled through the narrow lanes like a secret. Meat in the pot. A smell so rare that it made people pause, lift their heads, and guess whose turn it might be. Perhaps a wedding, perhaps a funeral, or perhaps someone's old pig had finally died. For the medieval peasant, meat was not part of the daily diet. It was a guest, not a resident. Something that arrived for special occasions or unexpected luck, and then was gone again, remembered more than consumed. Most of the animals kept by villagers were not destined for the table. Chickens laid eggs, cows gave milk, pigs cleared scraps. To kill one meant giving up a future source of food or labor, and so they were kept alive as long as possible, only slaughtered when they could no longer produce. Old meat, stringy and tough, but still precious. When it was time, this animal was used from snout to tail. Nothing was wasted. The head became broth. The feet became jelly. The fat was rendered into lard, stored in clay pots. The intestines were cleaned and stuffed. Even the bones were boiled a second time, then a third. Each part was a chapter in a short-lived feast. Organs were common: the liver, heart, kidneys. Known as offal, they were deeply flavored, sometimes bitter, and always strong. The rich didn't care for them, so they were left for the poor. Stewed, boiled, sometimes roasted on a stick over a fire. They filled the belly, even if they turned the stomach. Poultry was more accessible. A village might have hens, and if one stopped laying or fell ill, it became stew. A rooster might be cooked for a feast. But chickens were small and wiry, their meat nothing like the plump birds we know today. Even a full-grown goose, shared between many, vanished quickly. Hunting was not a right. It was a crime. The forests belonged to the king, or the lord, or the church. Poaching, though common, was dangerous. A man caught trapping a rabbit or spearing a deer in royal woods could lose his hand, or worse. Still, it was done. Quietly, at night, with snares and slings. A single bird or squirrel might mean a full pot for 2 days. Children were taught to watch the trees. Women plucked feathers in silence. Bones were buried deep in the hearth ashes. There were fishing rights, too, claimed by abbeys and nobles. Rivers and lakes were guarded as jealously as forests. A peasant living by water might fish anyway, casting lines in secret, drying small catches in the attic rafters. Fish, while more accessible than meat, were often preserved, salted until nearly inedible, or smoked so long they cracked when cut. Eel was common in England. Herring was common across the north. The meat was oily and the salt lingered on the tongue for hours. But it kept. That was what mattered. During Lent and other fasts, meat was forbidden by the church. Fish was allowed, even required. But not everyone could afford fish, so loopholes were invented. Beavers, for example, were declared fish on account of their tails. Otters, too. It was not about logic, it was about survival. If an animal swam, it could be eaten. In winter, salted pork became a centerpiece. If a family had managed to fatten a pig through the summer, they might slaughter it just before the cold set in. The meat would be rubbed with salt, hung in smoke, or stored in brine. It would shrink, toughen, dry out, but it would be there. A slab of smoked bacon, pulled from the rafters, could flavor weeks of meals, not eaten in slices, but shaved into stews, dropped into pottage, or boiled into broth. Its taste lingered long after the meat was gone. The nobility, by contrast, lived in a world of abundance. Deer, boar, swan, crane. Massive roasts carved in halls, filled with candlelight. Their dogs fed better than many peasants. Their tables sagged with meat pies, game birds, spiced venison, all served in sequence and ceremony. But even their feasts had dangers. Without refrigeration, spoilage was common. Spices masked rot. Sauces hid decay. A noble could die just as easily from a bad stew as a poor man from starvation. And, in the manor kitchens, the servants watched. They carried the bones and scraps away in silence. Some pieces were gifted to the village. Others disappeared quietly, shared between hungry hands. The memory of meat lasted longer than the meal. It was told in stories. Of the time father caught a pheasant. Of the night old Margaret roasted a piglet after her wedding. These stories fed the heart, when the stomach could not be filled. But mostly, meat was absence, an idea, a longing. It was what lay behind the scent in the air, the twitch of the nose, the slow turning of heads toward someone's chimney. When meat came, it was a small holiday, a day without bitterness, a day when the fire smelled rich and the spoon scraped the pot with satisfaction. But for the rest of the year, it was just a dream. And yet, even that dream could lead to risk, to traps in forbidden forests, to whispered poaching, to punishment. In the next chapter, we'll follow the salted scent of fish and the sour tang of dried goods, into the strange world of preserved food, where nothing was fresh, but everything tried to last. Fish, salty, dry, and uninspiring. It always began with the salt. Not the fine, white crystals tucked into our modern cupboards, but thick, damp clumps, gray or brown, gathered from shallow coastal pans or traded at high cost from lands far away. Salt was not seasoning. It was survival. In the medieval world, where meat was rare and refrigeration had not yet been dreamed of, salt turned fish into time. A fresh catch could be turned into food that lasted for weeks, even months. But the taste it left behind was something else entirely. For those who lived near rivers or the sea, fish was more familiar than meat. It swam in the background of daily life, less a delicacy than a possibility. Children with rough nets stood barefoot by the banks, while older men cast lines from small boats. The catch was humble: herring, eel, perch, cod when the waters allowed. Yet most fish didn't stay fresh for long. It couldn't. In the absence of cold storage, preservation was the rule, not the exception. And so the fish were salted, layered in barrels between thick slabs of crystal, their flesh slowly drawn dry and tight. Others were smoked over green wood, hung from rafters like laundry, hardening into something leathery and dark. This fish was not the flaky, white fillet of a seaside meal. It was dense, chewy, briny to the bone. It needed hours of soaking to soften, and even then, it tasted more of salt than sea. But it filled the belly, and that was enough. Inland, preserved fish was often the only kind available. It arrived in markets in great barrels, hauled from ports by mule and cart, sloshing with brine and wrapped in linen. It was expensive, but not unreachable. Townsfolk pooled coins for it. Villagers traded eggs or cloth to acquire it before the feast days arrived. The church had declared many days meatless. Lent alone stretched for 40, and then came dozens more throughout the calendar. Fridays, saints' vigils, fasts of all kinds. On these days, no meat could be eaten, but fish was permitted. And so, fish became a necessity for the faithful, even if it brought no joy. The wealthy, of course, found ways to make fish beautiful. They dined on fresh trout from their private ponds, carp raised in still waters behind abbey walls. These fish were cooked in almond milk, spiced with ginger, wrapped in gold leaf pastry. Some were molded to resemble fantastical creatures, their heads reattached after cooking to maintain the illusion of abundance. But for the poor, fish was simple and often sad. Eel was a common staple, especially in England. It slithered through muddy creeks and was trapped in woven baskets, its flesh oily and strong. It could be fried, if fat was available. More often, it was boiled, sometimes chopped and set in a cold pie, encased in jelly, the bones picked free with careful fingers. Herring was the workhorse of the sea. It came salted, smoked, dried, or pickled. Entire coastal economies were built on it. In towns like Bergen or Yarmouth, herring ships lined the docks by the dozen. Their cargo fed cities and villages alike, reaching even the smallest inland manors where no fresh fish had ever been seen. Cod was harder, but beloved. Dried to the texture of wood, it had to be pounded with a mallet before cooking. It was soaked in water for hours, sometimes a day, just to become edible again. Even then, it flaked like parchment and carried the sea on its skin. But it fed many, and that was what mattered. Spoilage was always a risk. Poor salt meant poor preservation. A sour smell, a slick texture, a strange discoloration, signs that the fish had turned. But many ate it anyway. Hunger was persuasive. Sickness was familiar. Sometimes, in rare moments of luck, a fresh fish might be caught and cooked the same day. A trout from the stream, a perch from the mill pond, fried over a clean fire, sprinkled with herbs from a monastery garden. Such meals lived in memory. A child might remember it for years. A widow might speak of it at winter's end. Fish was also trade. Monasteries sold it, towns taxed it, kings licensed its harvest. Fishing rights were not always free. To cast a net in the wrong place could mean fines or worse. Water, like land, was claimed. And still, fish came. Quietly, persistently. Through foggy mornings and bitter winters, from the hands of men on boats and women at market stalls. It was rarely loved, but it was dependable. In the monasteries, where meals followed the bells, fish was often the main course. The monks grew skilled at its preparation. Gentle stews, pounded pastes, thickened sauces to soften the salt. They wrote recipes, some surviving still, revealing how much care could be given to something so modest. But for most, fish was a compromise. A thing to eat when nothing else could be had. Dry, brittle, and sometimes bitter. Its smell lingered in clothes, its bones lodged in throats. But it nourished. It kept the cold at bay. It helped one survive another day. And so it remained, a presence in the pot, a scent on the wind, a promise that while nothing tasted good, at least something could still be eaten. But even fish could not be trusted for long. Without proper storage, everything spoiled eventually. And so, the medieval cook turned to older arts. Pickling, drying, fermenting, methods that could bend time, just a little. Let's follow them now, into the cellar, where vegetables soured and fruits withered, but still remained. Adulterated bread and watery ale. The bread was hard, not simply stale, but dense and gritty, with a crust like bark and a crumb that crumbled into dust. And still, they ate it. In the medieval world, bread was not a treat or a comfort. It was the foundation of the diet, the center of every meal, the one thing most people could count on to be there, even if it wasn't always what it seemed. For the commoner, white bread was a myth. The soft, pale loaves we know today were the pride of the nobility, baked from fine, sifted wheat flour, kneaded in kitchens by servants with clean hands and steady heat. But for the rest of society, bread came dark, heavy, and uncertain. Made from rye, barley, oats, or whatever grain could be ground, it was shaped by necessity and baked under uncertain fire. The grain was rarely pure. It might contain bits of husk or straw. Sometimes, stones from poor milling would sneak into the dough, cracking teeth and scraping gums. And worse still, in hard years when crops failed or coins ran out, the dough would be stretched with whatever could be found. Ground acorns were common. Tannin-rich and bitter, they gave the bread a strange aftertaste that lingered. Sawdust, scraped from beams or floorboards, was added not for nutrition, but volume. Chalk or ground bone made it heavier. Even sand found its way into loaves when desperation ran deep. And so, what was meant to sustain the body slowly eroded it. The assize of bread and ale, a law passed in the 13th century, tried to regulate these deceptions. Bakers were required to follow standards of weight and quality, and punishments were severe. A dishonest baker might be placed in the pillory, his loaves tied around his neck for the village to mock. But enforcement was rare, and hunger more persuasive than law. In truth, many bakers adulterated not from greed, but from survival. Grain was expensive, profits were small. A bad harvest could ruin a baker as surely as a farmer, and so the line blurred, between theft and necessity, between flour and filler. Al told the same story. Clean drinking water was rare in many towns. Wells could be contaminated, rivers fouled by waste. Boiling was not yet standard practice. Instead, people turned to ale, a weak, fermented brew made from grain and water. Its mild alcohol content helped kill bacteria. Children drank it, the sick drank it, everyone drank it. But ale, too, could be deceived. Alewives, women who brewed and sold small quantities from their homes, were often accused of watering down their product. A cauldron might be stretched with another bucket of cloudy water. A mug might carry more froth than liquid. Bitter herbs were sometimes added to cover the sourness. And yet, people kept drinking. Because what else was there? A weak ale was still safer than a strong sickness. And though its nourishment was minimal, it was warmth in the stomach, comfort of a kind. Alewives became both essential and suspect. They were pillars of the village economy and easy targets for blame. If illness spread, it was the alewife's brew. If tempers rose, it was her measure. Some were accused of witchcraft, their bubbling pots mistaken for spells. Others were admired for their skill, their recipes passed down like family prayers. In some towns, brewing was a daily ritual. In others, it was shared, neighbors taking turns, lending barrels, swapping yeast. The ale went flat quickly and had to be drunk fast. It was not stored. It was consumed, then gone. But like bread, it too could carry risk. Poor fermentation led to sourness. Contaminated batches brought stomach cramps, fevers, worse. And when both bread and ale were compromised, stretched thin by poverty, masked by desperation, the very things meant to sustain life began to endanger it. Still, they endured. Mothers fed gritty bread to their children, chewing it first to soften the crust. Men drank ale that burned the throat, then rose at dawn to work again. The meals were small, the ingredients were questionable, but they were enough. Sometimes, when the weather was good and the grain grew tall and clean, the bread was better. The ale was richer. There were moments of satisfaction, even pride. A soft loaf, a mug that tasted like grain and sun. These were the memories that carried people through the lean years. But those lean years returned often, and when they did, so did the deception. Bread, meant to be the body of the meal, became the body's burden. Ale, meant to cleanse, became cloudy and suspicious. And yet the fire still burned each morning, and the pot was still filled. What else could they do? This was not a world of choice. It was a world of compromise. A world where bread could break your teeth, and ale could turn your stomach. And still both were better than nothing at all. But what happened when food wasn't just untrustworthy? When it was downright dangerous? Let's step now into the places where food was made and eaten, where pigs shared the floor and waste ran in the streets. Let's talk about hygiene, or the lack of it. The smell of home, livestock, and rot. There was always a smell. It lingered in the corners, seeped into the thatch, clung to the clothes like fog. A mix of wet earth, unwashed skin, ash from the hearth, and something sour that never quite left. The smell of a home that shared its space with the living, the dying, and everything in between. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between people and animals was thin, thinner still between the hearth and the barn. For many families, there was no separate space for livestock. The pig slept just feet from the children. Chickens roosted in the rafters. A cow might be tethered in the corner, close to the warmth of the cooking fire. It wasn't comfort, it was necessity. Livestock meant survival. A chicken laid eggs, a cow gave milk, A pig could be fattened through the summer and slaughtered in the fall. But these animals needed protection, especially in winter. There were no locked barns with hay-lined stalls. There were wolves, thieves, frost. And so the animals came indoors. The floor was often dirt, covered with straw or rushes that soaked up spills, slops, and waste. The rushes were rarely changed. Instead, more were simply added. Over time, they formed a thick, soft mat, a nest of decay beneath bare feet. It smelled of dampness and droppings. It crackled when stepped on and hissed softly when stirred. Fleas thrived in it. Lice, too. Insects were constant companions, especially during the warmer months. They bit, they crept, they fed. There were no soaps, no sprays, no clean sheets, just wool blankets and the occasional scratching. The air was thick with smoke. Chimneys were a luxury. Most cottages vented through a hole in the roof or a small opening above the door. The hearth fire, always burning low, filled the room with a soft, smoky haze that coated everything. Soot settled on beams, in hair, along the rims of cooking pots. And yet, this was home. Meals were prepared on the same surfaces where tools were sharpened and grain was ground. A wooden board might serve as both work table and altar, breadboard and changing table. The closeness of life was not romantic. It was practical. It was hard. In towns and cities, things were worse. The streets were narrow, unpaved, and thick with mud. Garbage was thrown from windows. Chamber pots emptied onto walkways. Rain spread everything: filth, decay, disease. Gutters were shallow ditches. Wells stood beside latrines. Contamination was not a risk. It was a certainty. Rats ran freely. They lived in walls, in cellars, in hay piles and pantries. Where there was food, there were rats. And where there were rats, there were fleas. And where there were fleas, there was plague. The Black Death, when it came, did not spread through armies or ships alone. It traveled in the quiet spaces, through grain sacks and feather beds, through crowded alleys and market stalls. A single cough, a single bite, and the whole village might fall silent. Even royalty was not immune. King John of England, history tells us, died from dysentery after feasting on spoiled peaches and new cider. His wealth could not shield him from the perils of medieval food or the invisible rot that came with it. In the market, meat hung in the open air. Flies buzzed, dogs sniffed, butchers worked without gloves or ice. The blood ran into the street. People stepped over it on their way to buy onions. In the home, leftovers were rare. Food was cooked and eaten quickly, or it spoiled. There were no sealed containers, no refrigeration. A stew might sit out overnight, warmed again the next day, souring slowly in the pot. If it smelled too strange, it might be thrown away. If not, it was eaten. Illness followed quietly. A stomachache, a fever, sometimes recovery, sometimes not. Hygiene, as we understand it now, did not exist. Hands were rinsed in shared basins. Dishes were scrubbed with ashes and sand. Clothes were washed in cold streams, rarely and without soap. Baths were taken, but not often. Some feared water could weaken the body, open the pores to disease. Others simply had no time. And still, life continued. Children played in the mud. Women cooked in smoky kitchens. Men rose early and returned late, carrying the scent of work into every room. People were born in these spaces, and they died in them. The rot was not separate from life. It was part of it. And yet, there was warmth. The fire, however smoky, gave heat. The rushes, however dirty, softened footsteps. The closeness, however chaotic, created something like community. In the dark months, when the wind howled outside and the pot bubbled quietly on the hearth, even the most humble hut became a place of shelter, a place of memory, a place of sleep. But the dangers remained. Each meal eaten in these conditions carried a risk. And when fasting seasons came, imposed by the church, they didn't cleanse the body. They weakened it. Let's walk now into that sacred tension between hunger and holiness and see how faith shaped what people were allowed to eat. Dining with disease. Why no one was really safe. Every meal carried a shadow. There was no way to know if today's bread would bring strength or sickness, whether the stew simmering on the hearth would satisfy or sicken. The food was often unfamiliar to the eye, even to the one who cooked it. Ingredients were altered, stretched, preserved past their prime, and the places where food was prepared were never clean. Disease was a quiet guest at every table. It traveled in the flour, in the spoiled ale, in the rushes on the floor. It lived in the cracks of wooden bowls, in the mouths of livestock tethered too close to the hearth, and in the water fetched from the same stream that carried the village's waste. And because people didn't yet understand bacteria or infection, they lived with illness like they lived with hunger, quietly, and with resignation. Diarrhea, fever, cramps, these were part of life. No one expected to feel well all the time. A day without stomach pain was a blessing. A week without someone falling ill was rare. The causes were not obvious. There were no microscopes, no sterilization, no knowledge of cross-contamination. Food was judged by sight, by smell, by feel. But these senses deceived. A loaf of bread could carry ergot, a mold that grew on damp rye and caused hallucinations, seizures, and death. A pot of pottage could sit too long by the fire, sour slowly, and still be eaten. Because what else could they do? In this world, food was either spoiled or soon would be, and everyone knew someone who had eaten something they shouldn't have. Sometimes that someone was a king. King John of England died in 1216 after eating a surfeit of peaches and drinking fresh cider, luxuries even for royalty. But they had spoiled, fermented, turned, and so he turned too, sickened in his carriage, weakened by the very wealth that allowed him to eat what others could not. His death was not exceptional. Nobles suffered as often as peasants did. Lavish banquets meant lavish risks. Spiced sauces, masking bad meat, long waits between cooking and serving, food left out for hours. The bigger the feast, the higher the danger, and the less anyone questioned the cook. In the cities, the risks multiplied. Open-air markets sold fish under the summer sun. Meat hung beside the street, swarmed by flies. Vendors shouted over piles of questionable pastries, still warm from an oven fueled with dung. Children ran barefoot through it all, brushing against carcasses, chewing sticky sweets with unwashed hands. And then came the plagues. The Black Death arrived like smoke on the horizon, fast and quiet. It swept through villages, towns, monasteries. Entire households vanished in days. Rats carried it, fleas carried it, people carried it, and food markets, crowded, noisy, unclean, became perfect places for it to spread. Food wasn't just dangerous, it was a vehicle. It connected every hand that touched it. The one who butchered, the one who salted, the one who sold, the one who served, the one who ate. In a world without gloves, without soap, without understanding, these connections formed invisible threads between the healthy and the sick. Water was no safer. Wells were shallow and often close to cesspits. A single rain could carry human waste into the village supply. And though ale was safer, it was not always available. In the end, everyone drank what they could find. And they got sick. Some recovered, many did not. There were no hospitals as we know them now. The ill lay in bed, surrounded by prayers and herbs, or they were left to die in silence. Mothers wept over children who grew pale after a simple meal. Men weakened slowly, their bodies giving up after too many seasons of spoiled food. And still, they kept eating. Because they had to. Because it was better to risk illness than face starvation. Because when a loaf was hard and sour, you simply soaked it in broth and ate it anyway. Because when meat smelled off, you added vinegar. When the milk curdled, you made cheese. There were remedies. Honey for the throat, garlic for the blood, mustard seed for digestion. But these were hopes, not cures. Faith was the real medicine. Prayer and fasting. The belief that suffering here meant reward later. And so, meals were taken with gratitude and fear. A spoonful of stew might nourish, or it might bring 3 days of fever. A sip of cider might warm the chest, or it might twist the stomach until morning. Even the wealthiest lived with this tension. Behind the carved wooden screens and silver goblets, the nobles dined as their servants watched, some in awe, some in quiet dread, because they too had seen sickness follow a feast. And in the monasteries, where meals were more careful, even there illness crept. A spoiled fish, a cracked jug of wine, a bad barrel of barley. Silence followed, but the table remained. People kept eating, and each meal was an act of faith. Even now, we forget how fragile food once was, how dangerous. The next time you cut a fresh apple, sip clean water, or eat a piece of cheese that won't make you ill, pause for a moment, because for centuries, that same moment was one of quiet risk. And in the next chapter, we'll step into the sacred tension between faith and food, the fasting seasons, the rules of the church, and how hunger was sometimes called holy. Church fasting, hunger for the soul. The bells rang out across the valley. Soft and slow, they marked the rhythm of life: prayer, labor, rest, and sometimes hunger. In the medieval world, the church did not simply guide the soul. It guided the stomach too. Fasting was not occasional. It was frequent, structured, and sacred. It shaped the calendar as firmly as the changing seasons. At least 100 days each year were marked by abstention, days when meat was forbidden, when dairy disappeared, when hunger became a form of devotion. Lent was the longest. 40 days before Easter, a season of penitence and reflection. But it was not alone. Advent carried its own gentle austerity. Every Friday was meatless, vigils before saints' days too, even Wednesdays in some regions. The faithful were expected to submit their appetites to the rhythm of the divine. But submission was not always easy. Imagine a peasant family, already scraping together what little they had. Their meals were never rich, their diet always modest, and yet the church asked for more. No meat, no eggs, no cheese, though I sees no butter. Just bread, perhaps, or fish, if it could be caught. Some boiled beans, a turnip or two, sour ale to wash it down. This was not indulgence denied, it was sustenance reduced. And still, they obeyed. Because the afterlife mattered more than the moment. Because the priest said that hunger made the soul cleaner, more worthy. Because suffering was not seen as punishment, but as preparation. Not everyone fasted equally. The rich often found ways around the rules. Fish was allowed, so they stocked their ponds with trout, carp, pike. Exotic ingredients found their way into Lenten feasts: almonds, spices, rare fruits. Butter might be donated to the church in exchange for permission to use it. But the poor had no such options. They fasted fully, and often painfully. Stories survive, quiet glimpses into these silent struggles. One tells of a woman named Margaret, mother of 3, who begged her priest to allow her children a scrap of meat during Lent. They were too thin, she said, too cold. The priest refused. Her husband, in despair, traded a wool cloak for a single rabbit. They cooked it late at night, in secret, with the windows closed and the fire low. It fed the children. But Margaret wept as they ate, because even in mercy there was guilt. The idea was simple. By denying the body, the spirit would rise. Hunger would make space for grace. The absence of flavor would draw attention to the presence of God. But the result was often exhaustion. Work did not stop for Lent. The fields still needed tilling. The fires still needed tending. Men labored from sunup to sundown with only a piece of dry bread in their pockets. Women carried water, chopped wood, stirred thin soups with hollowed cheeks. And yet the fast was kept. The church offered small comforts. On Sundays, the rules relaxed. Children, the elderly, and the sick were sometimes excused. Monasteries gave out alms, bread, ale, sometimes dried fish. But these were not enough to erase the ache. Still, people turned to the church for guidance. They believed that fasting aligned them with the suffering of Christ, that it cleansed their sins, that it taught humility. Hunger was not just tolerated, it was holy. And when Easter finally arrived, the bells rang brighter. The table filled, at least for a day. A chicken roasted over the fire, a pie filled with eggs and cream. Children laughed with crumbs on their lips. The fast was broken. But for many, the celebration was brief. The larders were still bare, the gardens still young. The church calendar soon brought another vigil, another abstention. Hunger returned, like a familiar guest. In the monasteries, fasting was more structured. Monks followed strict dietary rules. Their meals were small, simple: pottage, bread, ale, and sometimes fish. But they approached fasting not with dread, but with devotion. Silence accompanied their meals. Prayer surrounded their hunger. For them, the body was always in service to the soul. They wrote about it too. One abbot described Lent as a season of sharpening, a time when the senses dulled by routine were reawakened through restraint. Another compared fasting to tilling the soil, making it ready for new growth. But the poor did not write. They lived the fast in silence, in aching limbs and growling stomachs. They knew hunger not as metaphor, but as memory. And yet they followed the Church's guidance, trusting that their suffering had meaning beyond the physical. In the end, fasting was both burden and bond. It tied the people to each other, to the Church, to something higher. It reminded them that the body was temporary, and the spirit eternal. But still, it hurt. And it left them weaker, more vulnerable, more fragile. What happened when even that fragile balance tipped? When the rains failed, the stores emptied, and fasting was no longer a choice? Let's walk now into the silence of true famine. The years when the land gave nothing, and hunger became something darker than devotion. The Great Famine, a boring history of not eating. It began with rain, not a gentle spring drizzle, but weeks of gray skies that refused to lift, then months. The fields turned to sludge. Seeds rotted where they were sown. The rivers rose, and the wind stayed cold. It was 1315, and Europe had already endured so much. But now came the silence of hunger. The Great Famine did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like a shadow lengthening across the land. First came the failed harvests, then came the empty cellars, then the fear. Grain prices rose so quickly that even those with silver coins found themselves staring at bare shelves. Bread became smaller, darker, thinner. Meat disappeared, dairy soured. People turned back to their gardens, but the soil was too wet, and the sun too weak. And then the animals began to die. Horses, cows, pigs, their feed had run out. Hay was soggy. Pasture land drowned beneath weeks of unbroken storms. A farmer might stand in the doorway of his barn, watching a calf collapse from cold, unable to help. Even those animals that survived could not be spared. They were eaten. At first, it was done with sorrow. A family pig was more than food, it was memory. But hunger changed things. Grief made way for urgency. And soon, the animals were gone. The famine stretched across years, 7 long ones, from 1315 to 1322. The weather refused to return to its patterns. Winters came too soon. Springs came too late. Entire regions lost their crops again and again. In some towns, 1 in 4 people died. The records are quiet, but bleak. In the city of Ypres, monks kept count, 16 deaths per day during the worst months. In London, poorhouses overflowed. In the countryside, villages shrank. Some disappeared entirely. People ate what they could. Grain, ground with acorns or bark. Leaves, boiled into sludge. Roots, scraped from frozen ground. There are stories, half-whispered and hardly believed, of people digging up the graves of the newly buried, of mothers abandoning children, of neighbors turning away with eyes that could no longer afford to see. The famine did not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked. The Church fasted, but it too began to crack. Monasteries ran out of food to distribute. Abbey gardens withered. Even the rich could not summon crops with gold. The king himself, Edward II, found little comfort. Grain had to be imported, often at great cost and uncertain delivery. Even royal granaries thinned. There were no relief programs, no government aid. Only what could be stored, bartered, or borrowed. And when there was nothing left to barter, people sold themselves. Bonds of service were traded for a sack of flour, a year of labor for a few crusts of bread. Markets emptied, ale grew thin, even salt became scarce. Bread, when it could be found, was adulterated with everything imaginable: bean flour, clay, chaff. It was less food, more filler, and yet it was still hoarded, still stolen. People died with their mouths full of bread that couldn't nourish them. The famine changed people. Children stopped growing, bodies thinned, spirits dulled, birth rates dropped. So did marriages. What vows could be made when the next meal was uncertain? And still the rain came. Eventually, as all things do, it passed. The sun returned, timid at first, then steady. The land dried. Crops began to sprout again. Slowly the people emerged from their grief, thinner and quieter. The famine had left its mark, not just on bodies, but on memory. Some rebuilt, others could not. Entire family lines vanished. Fields were abandoned. Old men stared at their plates, grateful for a crust of bread, but unable to forget what it meant when there was none. It would not be the last famine, but it was among the worst. And for those who survived it, time itself seemed to divide, before the rains and after. We rarely think of famine as history. It has no kings, no battles, no banners. It leaves behind few monuments, only absences, empty homes, blank pages, forgotten fields. But the famine was real. It shaped how people saw the world. It deepened their faith, or broke it. It hardened their sense of community, or shattered it. And it made the presence of food, even a bowl of porridge, feel sacred. Yet even in its depths, there were whispers of change. The massive loss of life created strange ripples. With fewer mouths to feed, some peasants found new leverage. Wages rose, land opened. For a brief moment, life improved. But how long could it last? Let's walk now into that strange window of plenty, when meat returned to the table, and for once, the poor could taste what had long been reserved for the feast halls above. The taste of meat, a brief moment of plenty. It was not abundance, but it was more than before. After the great famine loosened its grip, the land, tired as it was, began to give again. The rains subsided, the sky cleared, seeds took root, and something strange happened. There were fewer people to feed. Entire villages had vanished. Fields once crowded with tenants lay open, and where there had once been too many mouths, there were now too few hands. The laborers who remained began to realize something quietly powerful. They were needed. Wages rose, slowly and not without resistance, but they did. Lords who once gave orders now offered coin. Landowners offered leases. The market, once controlled from above, began to shift beneath the surface. And for a brief time, the poor had something they had never truly known: choice. With that choice came meat, not daily, not in abundance, but regularly enough to change the memory of hunger into something less immediate. A rabbit from the woods, a hen from the backyard, a side of pork, salted and shared. For the first time in memory, meat became accessible, not just on feast days, but on ordinary ones. Peasants began raising more livestock, not just for lords, but for themselves. Chickens were kept, not only for eggs, but for stew. Pigs were bred and fattened, then slaughtered with care and ceremony, their meat preserved in brine or smoke. Every part used, nothing wasted. The bacon hung from the wooden beams, the sausages coiled like rope. Even the fat, so precious, was rendered into lard, kept in earthen pots, used to fry or spread or soften a crust of hard bread. It was still humble, but it was meat, and with meat came strength. Men worked longer in the fields. Women bore children with fewer complications. The old lived slightly longer. The young grew slightly taller. A kind of slow restoration passed through the villages, not dramatic, but steady. People began to plan again, not just for survival, but for seasons ahead. Feasts returned. At weddings, pork was roasted. At harvest, fowl were stewed. On Christmas, a goose might be shared, and for a moment, the cottage smelled like plenty. Children watched the juices drip, the skin crackle, the herbs hiss in the heat. For many, it was the first time food felt like celebration, not obligation. Markets reflected the change. Butchers set up stalls with salted meats. Tanners had more hides to cure. Bakers found customers with enough fat to enrich their dough. Alewives, now better paid, brewed stronger batches. Life, once gray and thin, developed layers. But it would not last. In 1348, the Black Death arrived, and once again, the tables emptied. The animals roamed, untended. The markets fell silent. Death came quicker this time, more cruelly. The changes wrought by the famine were deepened by the plague, and though meat remained, it came to be seen not as luxury, but as last rites. Still, some things endured. The taste of meat, its memory, remained in the mouths of those who survived. It had become part of their expectation, their identity. They no longer accepted only cabbage and porridge. They had tasted more, and that taste lingered. In its wake, the plague brought yet more change. Laborers now held even more power. With half the population gone, their hands were needed more than ever. Wages rose again. Restrictions were resisted. And with this came not just more meat, but the idea that food could be fair. It was not a revolution. Not yet. But it was a beginning. For a brief moment, the poor tasted what had once been reserved for the noble. And in doing so, they came to understand the imbalance, not just of land or law, but of hunger. They began to ask different questions. Why must some starve while others feast? Why must meat be a symbol of power? Why must bread be stretched with clay when pigs fill the noble's pens? The answers would take centuries, but the taste remained. And sometimes, that's all it takes. But there was one place where food and status were never so clearly divided, where every dish spoke in symbols, and every bite was a message. Let's step now into the world of medieval banquets, where spectacle was more important than substance, and the illusion of abundance was worth more than its taste. Banquets and illusions. When food was theater. Not every table in the medieval world was bare. In the high halls of castles and courts, where the ceilings arched like cathedrals and the tapestries blocked the wind, food was not merely nourishment. It was performance. Here, meals were staged. The nobility did not eat in silence or shadow. They ate in view of others, in a room lit by torches and filled with music, with dogs curled at their feet and pages moving soundlessly between the long benches. The clatter of knives, the whisper of linen, the scent of rosemary and roasting fat, it was all part of the display. The banquet was a kind of theater, and the food, its scenery. Whole beasts were brought to the table, their bodies transformed into symbols of power. A roasted boar's head, its mouth stuffed with apples and cloves, stared out from the platter like a mask. Swans were skinned after cooking and then redressed in their own feathers, posed as if in flight. Peacocks arrived the same way, shimmering and cold, their beauty untouched by the fire. These were not meals, they were messages. To dine on such a bird was to show that one could command not only the animal, but the people, the kitchen, the land itself. To eat extravagantly was to remind others of your rank, and to waste, intentionally, visibly, was to say that you had more than enough. But most of what glittered on the noble's table was not gold. Behind the spectacle lay humble roots, turnips, onions, barley. The chefs simply knew how to dress them. Spices, brought by traders at great cost, cinnamon, cloves, saffron, were added not for flavor alone, but for color, for surprise. Dishes were dyed bright yellow, tinted green, glazed with sugar or wine. And sometimes, food was made to look like something else entirely. A meat pie might open to reveal live birds, fluttering into the rafters. Marzipan fruits could be shaped like fish. Custards dyed with spinach were molded into trees. The banquet became a pageant, where delight mattered more than fullness. The guests rarely ate everything. Food was passed, admired, tasted, and often set aside. There was too much. There was meant to be too much. Gluttony was a vice for the poor. For the rich, it was performance art. Meanwhile, the servants watched. They waited behind curtains, in kitchens where the heat never left, and the air was heavy with smoke and orders. They scraped the bones, gathered the scraps, sometimes sneaking bites if the steward turned away. The second table, where they ate, was quieter, darker, and far less adorned. And beyond the castle walls, the village still boiled its cabbages, still soaked its bread in broth, still went to bed hungry. The contrast was not questioned. It was the way of things. But even among nobles, the food could deceive. The dishes were rich, too rich, heavy with fat and spice. They sat poorly in the stomach, especially after wine. Indigestion was common. So were strange remedies, powders, elixirs, heated stones. But discomfort was secondary to display. The nobility dined in order. The highest ranked tasted first. A wrong bite in the wrong mouth could be an insult, or worse, a sign of poison. And so tasters were employed, young men, often servants, who sampled each dish before it reached the lord. If they survived, the plate was passed along. If not, another was found. Poison was always a threat in politics, and in the theater of dining, nothing could be trusted. Still, the banquets continued. They marked marriages, treaties, victories, even funerals. Food as ritual, food as spectacle, food as power. But not always as pleasure. Many nobles died early, from fevers, from injuries, from gout, too much meat, too little movement. The richness they displayed turned on them, and their kitchens, so skilled in illusion, could not save them from decay. When the candles dimmed and the guests returned to their chambers, the food was cleared, the peacock's feathers saved, the bones discarded, the illusion faded, and in the silence of the empty hall, the echoes of laughter lingered. Meanwhile, in a cottage far away, a mother stirred her pot of onions and roots, hoping the taste would be enough to quiet her child's belly. Her meal was not a performance, but it would be remembered longer. In the end, food told stories of hunger and power, of celebration and control, of resilience and illusion. And though centuries have passed, we still carry those stories. In our feasts, in our fasts, in the quiet way we savor a meal when no one else is watching. Because long ago, food was not only what we ate, it was who we were. The air was thick with wood smoke and quiet voices. Somewhere beyond the fields, a church bell chimed the hour. It was autumn in a medieval village, late in the day, when the light leaned golden against the stone walls, and the scent of stew, meager but earnest, curled from cottage chimneys. The people here had little. A few turnips, onions, maybe a salted scrap of pork if they were lucky. Yet something stirred beneath the surface of that scarcity, a rhythm, a sharing, an ancient kind of communion. It was not the food alone that sustained them, but what the meal represented, a moment of togetherness in a world that often asked them to endure alone. In the heart of every village stood the communal oven. Built of stone and clay, it was large enough to bake dozens of loaves. Its walls, darkened from generations of fire. Each family brought their own dough, shaped by hand and memory, marked with symbols so it wouldn't be confused with another's. Bread was precious, grain was hard-won, but the oven was shared. It was here that people gathered not only to cook, but to listen, to rest, to whisper news, to offer advice. The warm belly of the oven glowed softly as the sun fell, and while the loaves rose inside, so did something gentler in the villagers themselves. A flicker of belonging, a subtle act of resistance against the loneliness of poverty. These shared rituals mattered. In a time when hunger haunted most days like a pale shadow, community became a kind of nourishment. They helped one another salt cabbages and hang herbs. They exchanged cups of barley ale and bowls of broth, small favors that made the difference between making it through the winter or not. And when the hunger became sharp, they grieved together too. Not every meal was somber. There were feast days, rare but precious. Weddings, christenings, the harvest festival. On these days, the simple act of eating transformed into something ceremonial. Children ran barefoot over packed earth as women roasted vegetables over open flame. Men played pipes. Even the poorest found a reason to smile. But more often, food was a reminder of what they lacked. Grain could rot. Crops could fail. The nobleman's tax could take the last sack of barley. And yet, even in this narrow margin, they made space for each other. They learned to survive with the rhythms of the land. They sang while they worked. They saved seeds. They prayed for rain. To be poor in the Middle Ages was to walk a fine line. But no one walked it alone. If a woman lost her husband to fever, her neighbors helped gather firewood. If a child fell ill, someone always offered herbs or boiled water. The kitchen fires might have been low, the larders nearly bare. But the heart of the village was kept warm by these small generosities. Food, when it came, was hard-earned. Women like Matilda spent their days coaxing meals from near nothing. A few wild greens, a carrot, stale crusts turned into pottage. Her hands were red and raw from washing roots in icy streams. Her back ached from bending over the hearthstone, and still, each night, she found a way to feed her family. Matilda wasn't alone. Across the kingdom, women carried the memory of harvests and the knowledge of herbs. They knew which mushrooms were safe, how long to dry the onions, when to hang the ham to smoke. These tasks were never glamorous, never written in books. But without them, winter would have taken many more. Some say that famine made people selfish. But the records and the bones tell a gentler truth. In many villages, the wealthiest gave bread to the weakest, Orphans were taken in. Extra loaves were left at doorsteps without names. Even in hunger, there was dignity. It was not utopia. There were jealousies and hoarding and fear. But there was also something deeper, a knowing that tomorrow could be harder still, and that kindness cost nothing. It was this quiet code, passed from hearth to hearth, that kept the village alive. Even today, archaeologists find cooking pits and fire-blackened stones clustered close together, signs that people chose to prepare meals near one another, even when space allowed them privacy. Maybe they felt safer that way. Maybe they just liked the company. Or maybe, somewhere deep in the spirit, humans remembered what it meant to survive together. When we look back now, it's easy to see only the lack, the gruel, the stale bread, the long winters. But there was resilience there too, and a softness. They did not eat much, but they ate together, and that may have made all the difference. Because long before supermarkets or refrigeration or takeout menus, there was the bowl passed from hand to hand, the loaf broken and shared, the pot simmering with whatever could be spared. And in that shared hunger, something sacred simmered too. What might we find if we returned to that fire? Let us now travel to the stone kitchens of the lords and queens, where food took a different shape, lavish, opulent, but not without its own shadows. The privilege of a full belly, far from the smoke of village hearths, behind high stone walls and iron gates, a different world unfolded. In the great halls of medieval castles, food did not whisper, it roared. Here, tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from distant lands. Roasted pheasants with golden skin, stews rich with saffron and cloves, pastries shaped like animals, glistening with honey. The air was perfumed with wine and meat and flame, and laughter rang from vaulted ceilings while servants hurried to and fro. It was a theater of abundance, a performance of power. To eat extravagantly was to live beyond the reach of want, and for the lords and ladies of the court, every feast was a declaration. They had triumphed over hunger. But the illusion was more fragile than it seemed. While the nobility dined on swan and venison, the world beyond their walls trembled with famine and drought. The bread on their silver plates came from fields tilled by hands that rarely tasted it. The wine in their goblets flowed from vineyards where children worked under a punishing sun. The cheeses and fruits were gathered by people who had no place at the table. Still, the feast went on. In the royal kitchens, fires burned from before dawn. Cooks worked with quiet precision, cutting, boiling, stuffing, basting. They took pride in their craft. Many had apprenticed for years. But they also knew that a single spoiled dish could mean punishment. Not just a bruised ego, but a bruised body, sometimes worse. And so, each platter was a silent prayer for perfection. The pastry crisp, but not cracked. The meat tender, but not raw. The sugar spun into subtle shapes that pleased the eyes before the tongue. A royal feast was not just a meal. It was a performance of excess. Yet even here, within the splendor, danger lurked. Food preservation was unreliable. Even a fig too long in the sun could sour. Even the richest meats could rot if left unguarded. Kitchens were warm, yes, but too warm. Spices covered much, but not everything. And in the age before microscopes and cold storage, death could hide in a peach. Sometimes the feast ended not in applause, but in illness. Histories tell of nobles stricken by dysentery after a celebratory banquet, of queens doubled over with stomach pain, of kings who gorged themselves beyond safety, too proud to stop. In a world without limits, limits still existed, even for them. But those risks rarely stopped the show. To be seated at the high table was to know, if only for a night, the taste of the world. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, dates from the Levant. Each bite told a story of empire and conquest, of trade and tribute. Each dish was a map of power, and each guest at the feast was a player in a game of status that never paused. Meanwhile, in the same country, a mother might be rationing barley porridge among her children. A shepherd might chew bark to quiet the ache in his belly. A widow might sell her last hen for a handful of leeks. But the banquet paid no mind. It went on, because it had to. Abundance was not only nourishment, it was spectacle. For the rich, The act of eating became a ritual of distance, a reminder that they were not the ones laboring in fields, not the ones kneeling in dirt, not the ones measuring vinegar in teaspoons. In the noble court, no one watched the pot anxiously to see if it would boil. They summoned what they wished and sent back what displeased them. They complained of flavors too strong, too dull, too simple, too foreign, never too few. In their world, food was not survival. It was identity. But identity built on the backs of the hungry is never secure. The line between feast and famine was thinner than it seemed. A failed harvest, a rebellious tenant, a sudden pestilence. Any of these could fracture the illusion. Nobles might still eat, but their hold on comfort would tremble. And they knew it. Some tried to ignore the truth. Others gave alms in silence. A few fasted during Lent more devoutly than their position required. Not all were blind, but many were comfortable, and comfort dulls empathy. Today, it is easy to look back and judge, to see the gold, the silver, the stuffed pheasants, and sneer at the waste. But we, too, live in a time of contrast. Our supermarkets overflow, our pantries creak with options, and yet, outside the glow of our kitchen lights, hunger remains. The difference is that now we see it less. In the Middle Ages, the hungry were just beyond the gate, their faces visible, their suffering familiar. Today, they may be continents away, or a block down the street, wrapped in silence, tucked out of view. Still, we feel it, don't we? A soft disquiet when we throw food away. A flicker of guilt when we order more than we need. Somewhere inside, a memory stirs, of lean winters and thin broth, of our ancestors and the grace of enough. For most of human history, a full belly was a miracle, a second helping, a luxury, a shared loaf, a blessing. We forget this now, but our bones remember. There's a whisper in every meal, if you listen, a prayer, a promise, a reminder not to waste what once was sacred, and still is. What happens then, when the feast becomes too rich, even for those it was meant to serve? Let us turn now to the heart of the castle, the kitchen, and follow the royal cook as he prepares one such extravagant meal, one that might delight the court, or end in tragedy. The royal kitchen's burden. In the lowest level of the stone castle, beneath the tapestried halls and velvet chambers, fires never ceased. This was the royal kitchen, a cavernous space choked with smoke and steam, with stone walls slick with centuries of grease, and heat thick enough to blur the air. Here, among the cauldrons and spits, the cook reigned, not in silence, but in endless motion. He rose long before dawn, the sun still slumbering behind the castle walls. His name was not sung in songs, not carved into pillars, but his labor shaped the court's memory. The success of every banquet, every celebration, every diplomatic feast rested in his hands. And so Guam the royal cook did not rest. On this morning, wagons had arrived before light, their wooden wheels rumbling across the flagstones. Barrels of wine from the vineyards in Burgundy, crates of dates, pepper, and nutmeg brought by merchant ships from the east, wheels of cheese from the Alpine valleys, slabs of venison, boar, and goose, still glistening with blood. His apprentices hauled it all in, dozens of hands, dozens of voices, one breathless operation. There was no silence here. Knives scraped, spits turned, ovens cracked open, and the deep bubbling of broth sounded like voices in conversation. Dough was kneaded with raw fists. Herbs were plucked and minced with swift, practiced rhythm. The scent of cinnamon clung to the air, layered with roasted meat and wood ash. It was beautiful in its chaos, and exhausting. The cook moved through the kitchen like a captain steering a ship. Every dish had its own rhythm, its own timing. He knew them all, when the swan must be dressed, when the honey glaze should be applied, how long the eel must boil before it turned bitter. His mind was a clock, ticking not by hours, but by aromas and textures. There was no room for fatigue. And yet, fatigue always found a way in. This feast was not a simple affair. The king had summoned guests from 3 kingdoms, and every dish had to dazzle. The pressure was suffocating, but failure was not an option. To overcook the lamb was not a small error. It was disgrace, dishonor. A whisper of incompetence in a place where power and perfection were never far apart. And so Guam oversaw the gilded pies, the molded aspics, the subtle sugar sculptures that would decorate the tables. He corrected a too thick sauce with a flick of the wrist. He tasted, he scolded, he adjusted. All around him, the kitchen hummed like a great organism made of tired limbs and sharp blades. But even as he worked, a heaviness pressed on him. He had once been a baker's son. His mother fed him bread with onion, sometimes a scrap of meat on feast days. She taught him how to make do, how to stretch, how to wait. He carried those lessons now, even here, beneath vaulted ceilings and stained glass. Because while he carved golden apples and stuffed pastries with dates and almonds, he remembered the smell of boiled roots, of barley stew thinned with too much water, of empty bowls licked clean. And he knew every loaf, every roast, every dish he prepared tonight would not feed the hungry. It would delight the powerful, and that difference carved a quiet wound in him. The nobles above would marvel. They would sip and laugh and wipe crumbs from their jeweled collars. They would compliment the artistry, never imagining the hours of labor below their feet. And when the night ended, much would be discarded, beauty wasted, food scraped into the fire because it had cooled. Guam hated that most of all. Still, he did his duty. He took pride in his work. His mother had told him, if you must feed kings, feed them well, but never forget what hunger looks like. As the day wore on, the feast neared completion. A towering subtlety, a sculpture of sugar shaped like a castle, stood at the center of the kitchen, waiting to be unveiled. The roast swan gleamed under a glaze of saffron and cloves. Bowls of jeweled aspic quivered on silver platters. Everything was ready. And yet, Guam felt no joy, only a quiet ache, the knowledge that just outside the walls, a mother might be boiling nettles for supper, that the men who harvested the onions would never see the dish they now perfumed, that the herbs used for decoration were worth more than a peasant's weekly wage. He could not say these things aloud. He could not voice the question that haunted him. What is the worth of a feast if it feeds only the powerful? But still, he cooked, because that was what the world required. When the servants came to collect the dishes, the kitchen fell quiet. The fires crackled. The breathless rush was over. The cook leaned against a pillar and closed his eyes, the scent of roasted meat still clinging to his hair. He was proud. He was exhausted. And he was filled with a longing he could not name. Perhaps it was for a different kind of meal, one eaten slowly, among equals, one shared not in splendor, but in peace. A meal where no one went hungry after. But such things did not exist here. Not in the castle, not in this age. Outside, the great hall erupted in laughter. Goblets clinked, platters emptied. The feast had begun. And beneath it all, Guam listened to the noise of celebration from below. Would the guests ever think of the hands that made their meal? Let us now drift away from the splendor, into the shadow it cast, a shadow shaped like hunger, like a child pressing their nose against the walls of a world they would never enter. Food poisoning, fit for a king, in the high towers of medieval power, where kings gave orders and armies marched at their command, not even royalty could escape the quiet dangers of the dining table. The stories often speak of swords and treaties, of crowns and crusades, but history also turned, quietly, over a bowl of fruit, left too long in the sun. It was the year 1216. King John of England was weary. The barons had turned against him. His kingdom had fractured, and rebellion stirred in every corner. Still he marched, across fields, through rivers, from castle to castle, trying to hold together a crown that no longer fit. One evening, in the small town of Lynn, he sat down to eat. The meal was modest by royal standards. A few meats, some bread, cider to drink, and peaches, soft, golden-skinned, and rare. A delicacy. But the peaches had turned. Maybe it was the heat. Maybe they had been stored too long, wrapped in linen and shadow. No one noticed. Or if they did, they said nothing. You did not question what a king put to his lips. He ate, and within hours he fell ill. His stomach clenched. His head swam. The royal physician whispered of fever and bad air, of spiritual imbalance. They did not yet understand bacteria or microbes or spoiled fruit, but they knew what they saw. The king was dying. And so, Just days later, as he rowed across the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash, trying to escape the rising waters and the rebels behind him, he collapsed. His baggage train sank into the mud, along with his crown jewels, and the king himself withered in a nearby monastery, racked by pain and dysentery. Within a week, he was gone. Not by sword, not by poison in the political sense, but by the fruit of his own feast. The peaches were never blamed directly, but the story lingered, quietly, through time. A reminder that even kings are only human, that even power cannot outwit a peach too ripe. And King John was not the only one. Food poisoning did not care for titles or tapestries. It made no distinction between the silver spoon and the wooden bowl. In the Middle Ages, every meal was a gamble. Spoiled meat, tainted ale, moldy bread, all could sicken. And there was no refrigeration, no warning labels, no way to test or track. A dish could be beautiful and deadly. The wealthy might disguise it with spices, might roast it twice or cover it in honey, but the danger was still there. Beneath the flavor, a secret illness might stir. For the poor, the risks were different but just as sharp. Their food spoiled quickly, exposed to sun and vermin. Water came from wells or streams that could be fouled by animals or disease. Bread might be stretched with moldy grain. Porridge might hide insects. But hunger left little room for hesitation. They ate what they had. And sometimes they paid the price. The annals of medieval Europe record outbreaks of sickness traced to food. Monasteries where dozens fell after a shared meal. Villages struck down by tainted grain. Castles where nobles became pale and hollow-eyed after a feast too indulgent. There was no understanding of germs, no system of sanitation, only theories of imbalance, divine punishment, or foul humors. It was believed that food could carry moral energy, that meat made you lustful, that garlic stoked anger, that fasting purified not just the body, but the soul. But in truth, it was often simply the lack of cleanliness, the spoiled, the stale, the undercooked, that brought pain. Still, people ate, because they had to. The kitchen remained the heart of every home, even when it betrayed them. Mothers still stirred pots, cooks still turned the spits. Even knowing the risks, people clung to the ritual of meals. It was not only about nourishment, it was about comfort, about rhythm, about hope. In castles, banquets continued. Courses stacked upon courses, each more elaborate than the last. Sometimes 20 dishes in a single sitting. Nobles reclined on cushions, gorging on pies shaped like animals, meats wrapped in gold leaf, and sweetmeats soaked in rosewater. And after, some would grow sick, their bodies unable to keep up with the indulgence. But excess was expected. The feast had to impress, had to display wealth and strength and divine favor. To eat modestly would have seemed poor or pious, and neither was desirable. Even illness became a performance. Nobles blamed the cook, the air, the stars. Remedies were prepared, herbal infusions, leeches, prayers. But the damage had already been done, carried silently on the plate. Today, we rarely think of meals as dangerous. We refrigerate, we sanitize, we discard anything that seems off. The idea of dying from peaches would seem absurd. But in the medieval world, food was alive. It aged, it spoiled, it turned, and it turned quickly. To eat well was a mark of status. But to eat safely, that was pure luck. And so, King John's final feast became a quiet symbol of the risks wrapped in sweetness, of the truth that power cannot protect against the smallest rot. Even a king, in all his might, could fall from a fruit bowl. What then of those who had no choice? Who ate what little they had, knowing full well the dangers? Let us turn now to the peasant woman in her hut, kneeling by the hearth, salting scraps of meat and boiling turnips, praying they would last through the coming cold. Preserving winter hope, the wind had begun to shift. There was a sharpness in the morning air, a quiet tension carried on the breeze that rustled the thatched roofs and whispered through the trees. Autumn had arrived in the countryside, not in a blaze of gold, but in the steady fading of warmth. The sun sat lower in the sky. The earth smelled of damp soil and fading leaves. For Matilda, this was not a time of celebration. It was a signal, a reminder that the easy days were ending. that the long, lean months were coming. And there was work to be done. She woke early, before the birds, before the hearth had warmed the room. Her hands moved by memory now, reaching for the baskets, the knife, the cords of twine. On the table, the last of the summer's onions waited to be braided and hung. Outside, she had herbs drying in bunches under the eaves, thyme, sage, and parsley, tied with care. Every leaf, every root, every scrap mattered. There would be no waste. The small garden had given her beets and cabbages, though not as many as she had hoped. The carrots had done well, the beans less so. Her husband had slaughtered the old hen last week. They'd smoked the meat together quietly, in the stillness of the evening. They didn't speak of it, but they both knew. It might be all the meat they'd taste for months. This was the rhythm of survival. When the fields grew quiet and the trees went bare, the only food that remained was the food she could save. There were no markets to run to, no stores stocked with salt and sugar and grain, only her hands, and the fading warmth of autumn's last days. Matilda's home smelled of vinegar and smoke, of dried herbs and sour cabbage. There was a kind of comfort in it, faint perhaps, but familiar. Her children wrinkled their noses, but she smiled. These were the smells of preparation, of foresight, of care. In the corner of the cottage, crocks of pickled turnips lined the shelves. Apples wrapped in straw sat in baskets, slowly softening. The salted pork hung from the rafters, its skin darkened, its flesh slowly curing. She stirred the bubbling pot of barley porridge with one hand and counted the jars with the other. There was never enough, but still she tried, because winter, in this place, did not knock. It crept. It seeped through the cracks in the walls and curled around the edges of the hearth. It gnawed at your belly before it touched your toes. And when the food ran low, the cold grew louder. Matilda was not alone. All across the countryside, women like her moved through their homes with quiet determination. They gathered what they could, preserved what was left, and hoped it would carry them through the snow. This was not a dramatic battle. There were no drums, no speeches, just a daily, grinding effort against the silence of the earth. Some nights, when the children had gone to sleep and the wind howled outside, Matilda allowed herself to feel afraid. She would sit by the embers of the fire and wonder, had she done enough? Was there still time to find more wood, more grain? She thought of the little ones growing thinner, of the aches that would return when the food grew scarce. But fear, too, had to be preserved, set aside until needed. And so she kept working. They say that history remembers kings and battles, but there are other kinds of stories too, softer ones, like the story of a woman hunched over a barrel, pressing cabbage into brine with fingers stiff from cold, or the story of a girl hanging onions in the eaves, the tips of her braids dusted with ash. These were the quiet victories. These were the unseen acts of courage. Because to prepare for winter was to believe in spring. To salt a ham was to say, "We will make it through." To dry beans, to boil jars, to store apples with care, these were all small prayers. Not just for survival, but for something more enduring. For joy, for rest, for one more harvest. The world beyond Matilda's cottage did not ask for her story. The scribes would not write her name. The nobles would not taste her broth. But in her home, she was everything. Cook, healer, planner, guardian of warmth. And in that role, she became something quietly heroic. Not all succeeded. There were winters that swallowed the weak, that turned careful homes into tombs. But still, every year, the women preserved. Because they had to. Because no one else would. Sometimes, the neighbors shared. If one family had more vinegar, another more jars, they would trade. Not out of wealth, but out of need. And this barter, this mutual tending, was another kind of preservation. Of the community, of the spirit. The village oven still smoked in the distance. Soon, others would bring their dough. The loaves would rise together in the heat. And though there was little sweetness to offer, there was solidarity, enough to warm the belly, if not fill it. Matilda sat down at the end of the day, her back aching, her fingers raw. She tore a piece of bread from yesterday's loaf and dipped it into thin stew. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She looked toward this window. The sky had darkened. The first snow had not yet fallen, but the promise of it hung in the stillness. And she breathed in the scent of her own work, the pickled, the smoked, the dried, the stored. She listened to the soft breathing of her children asleep nearby. They would make it, or they would try. As the embers crackled, she closed her eyes and whispered her silent hope. Not for wealth, not even for ease, but for enough. And so let us now step beyond her cottage, toward the great hall, where firelight dances across stone and laughter rings out over golden plates. A place where feasts overflow, but where hunger still waits just outside the door. A feast you'll never taste. Beyond the quiet fields and smoke-streaked cottages, there stood the castle. It rose from the land like a memory of something ancient, stone upon stone, built not only to defend, but to declare. Its towers were tall, its walls thick, and at its center was the great hall, where warmth was not only found in the fire, but in the endless flow of food. Inside, the world was different. Here, hunger did not press at the door. It was held at bay by walls and wealth, by spices brought from oceans away, by bread that never grew stale. It was a place of excess, of ceremony, of noise and fragrance and golden light. At the head of the table sat the lord of the manor, rings on his fingers, a goblet in his hand. Before him, a roasted swan gleamed beneath layers of butter and clove. Its neck curved into a proud, decorative arch. The tables around him bent beneath the weight of pies, pastries, stews, and spiced meats. Platters of sweetmeats, shaped like animals. Bowls of pomegranate seeds glistening like rubies. Nothing was plain. Everything had been crafted to delight. The air itself seemed heavy with flavor. Torches lined the walls, flickering against tapestries that told old stories of knights, saints, and endless battles. Minstrels plucked soft chords from lyres in the corner, singing songs no one truly heard. Voices rose in laughter. The scent of mulled wine filled every breath. It was a feast, but not for everyone. Beyond the gates, in the dark, someone watched. A stable boy, a servant, a hungry child wrapped in wool too thin for the season. They could smell it, the roast, the bread, the cinnamon drifting through the air like a cruel dream. They could almost see it, if they craned their necks and imagined hard enough. But it wasn't for them. It never had been. This was the quiet cruelty of the medieval feast. Not its presence, but its distance. Not that it existed, but that it never reached beyond the stone. For every man who tore meat from the bone at the Lord's table, 100 more knelt in the mud, chewing barley and hoping for frost that would not ruin their stores. For every woman who dabbed her lips with silk after tasting honey-glazed pears, 12 more sat by hearths scraping burnt pottage from the bottom of iron pots. And yet the feast continued. Servants bustled through the hall, their arms aching with silver dishes. They did not eat, but they carried the food. They carved it, poured it, polished what was left. And when the banquet ended, they carried away the scraps, some to be fed to dogs, some simply thrown into the ash. The noise quieted, the flames dimmed, and still the hunger beyond the walls remained. To feast was not only to eat, it was to perform, to display wealth, power, and divine favor. A noble did not simply feed his guests. He impressed them. He overwhelmed them. He reminded them who could afford saffron and who could not, who had almonds in winter, who had oranges in the north, who had enough to waste. And it was wasteful. Dishes untouched, platters returned with barely a slice taken, bread hardened by the hour, discarded as new loaves arrived. So much effort, so many hands, so many ingredients, all for a moment of spectacle, then silence. But the silence was not total. The cook sat below stairs, exhausted. The bakers cleaned flour from their sleeves. The boys who turned the spits washed their hands in cold water. The feast had ended for the noble guests. For the ones who made it, it had never truly begun. And outside, the night turned colder. A woman in a nearby village held her son close. She fed him warm milk, sweetened slightly with honey saved from last year's hive. It was a quiet meal, but it was made with care, with sacrifice. She did not dream of roast swan or gilded pies. She dreamed only of having enough to feed him again tomorrow. The castle did not see her, nor did it need to. Feasts in the Middle Ages were designed to separate, to elevate a few and forget the rest. They were not evil in intent. They were simply the shape power took when it had plenty. It is easy now to see images of these banquets and marvel. The costumes, the colors, the absurd dishes, stacked like sculptures. But few pause to wonder who went without, who grew the grain for the bread, who boiled the wine, who never even saw the hall from the inside. This was the world, one table overflowing, 1,000 others nearly empty. And it wasn't only food. It was a mirror of the world itself. How it was divided, who served and who was served, who watched and who was watched, who tasted sweetness and who only dreamed of it. In that way, the medieval feast tells us more than any battle or law. It shows us what power did when it was full, and what silence looked like when it came from those who were not. So next time you see a medieval painting of a banquet, with its towers of meat and rivers of wine, look a little further, beyond the canvas, beyond the table. Can you hear the wind outside the castle walls? Someone is still hungry. And as we leave the warmth of the hall, let us follow the scent of ale down the winding cobblestone lanes, to a woman named Agnes, whose brew offered a small comfort to the weary, until survival required a compromise she never wanted to make. The alewife's dilemma. Down a narrow lane paved with mud and memory, past the cries of vendors and the hiss of boiling pots, there stood a low-beamed tavern. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney. The windows were smudged with the breath of the city, and the door hung open just enough to invite in the weary. This was where Agnes worked and brewed. She was not a noble, not a servant. She was something in between, a brewer of ale, known throughout the town for her steady hand, her quick tongue, and the warm comfort of the drink she made. She brewed in the mornings, served in the evenings, and in between, she scrubbed her jugs and counted her coins. Ale was not a luxury in the Middle Ages. It was survival. The water was often foul, teeming with things too small to see. But the brewing process, boiling, fermenting, killed the dangers. Even children drank it, weak, mild, but safer than the well. It was nourishment in a cup, a daily bread in liquid form. And for many, it was the only comfort they had. Agnes knew this. She saw it in the faces of the men who staggered in after a day of hauling stones or mending roofs. She saw it in the women who came to warm their hands, to trade gossip and forget for a moment the cold at home. They came not just for the drink, but for the peace it brought. She took pride in that, in giving them something that soothed. But pride doesn't pay taxes. The price of grain had risen again. The barley that once filled her sacks now cost twice as much, and the taxes on her small business weighed heavy. Every pint poured was a calculation between generosity and survival. And so, one day, she made a choice. She added water to the brew, just a little, just enough to stretch it, enough to sell one more jug, enough to cover the rent on her corner of the market square. Enough, she told herself, to get through the week. But it changed things. The ale tasted thinner, the foam faded quicker, the deep, earthy bite of the hops was muted. She saw it in the faces of her customers. The puzzled tilt of a brow, the pause before swallowing, a grumble here, a frown there. One man said nothing, but pushed his cup away unfinished. Agnes smiled, deflected, poured another. But inside, her stomach churned. This was not what she had meant to do. She had built trust, brew by brew, year by year. She had learned when to add the herbs, how long to let it rest, how to keep the barrels cool in summer. Her ale had been honest, until now. And yet, what choice had she? The taxes were not optional. The grain would not get cheaper. Her roof still leaked. Her children still needed bread. She sat by the fire that night, the empty jugs stacked behind her, and listened to the wind scraping against the shutters. Her hands were cracked from scrubbing, her apron stained. The tavern was quiet, the fire low. The coins in her pocket felt heavier than usual, but not in the way she'd hoped. That's the thing about compromise. It gives, but it takes. A little more coin, a little less peace. And so Agnes brewed again the next morning. The steam rose, the scent filled the room, and she stood over the bubbling pot, staring into the foam, asking herself whether today would be different. She could water it again, or not. She could risk her name, or risk her bread. These were not choices written in books. These were the quiet decisions of women who lived in the corners of history, the ones who made things work even when nothing did. There were other alewives in the city. Some did the same, some did worse. Some added herbs to disguise the thinness. Others stirred in chalk, or bitter roots, or even spoiled grain to bulk it up. And when the inspectors came, if they came, it was shame or a fine, or worse. But more often, no one came at all, because the townspeople needed their ale, just as Agnes needed their coin. Everyone pretended not to notice, because survival, like ale, was sometimes easier to swallow when watered down. Still, not all was lost. Agnes began to adjust. She bartered with a farmer for better hops. She dried wild herbs to stretch the flavor. She watched the barrels more closely. And over time, the brew thickened again. Not every day, but most. And those who drank it began to return. Slowly, quietly. She never spoke of the thin batches. She never apologized. But she never forgot either. The shame, the silence, the ache of doing something necessary and knowing it wasn't quite right. Because in the end, her work was not just ale. It was ritual. It was trust. And once broken, trust takes time to ferment again. In the far future, books would speak of kings and wars, but not of Agnes, not of the choices made in small kitchens, not of the hands that stirred and scraped and worried. But those choices shaped the days, quietly, like yeast rising unseen. Some nights, as she wiped the tables clean and blew out the lanterns, Agnes thought about what she'd become. Not just an alewife, but a mother, a keeper, a survivor. And that was enough. Now, as the lantern fades, let us step from the tavern's warmth into the cold air once more, and follow the scent of cinnamon and honey up the stone staircases of a castle, where a cook has created something so beautiful, so indulgent, that it feels almost holy, even if it can never truly satisfy. The cook who fed kings and starved inside, in a castle wrapped in ivy and crowned with turrets, the kitchens burned day and night. Fires glowed behind iron grates, and the smell of roasting meats curled through the corridors like incense. It was the eve of another royal celebration. The servants moved quickly, but the one they watched most closely was the cook. His name was Guam, and he did not smile. He was known across the land, not by title, but by skill. The king's cook, a master of his trade. His dishes were spoken of with reverence by those lucky enough to taste them, but his face was rarely seen at the table. He belonged to the fire, to the knife, to the quiet alchemy of food. Guam had learned the craft as a boy, apprenticing in kitchens where rats skittered underfoot, and the bread was hard enough to crack a tooth. He had burned himself more times than he could count. His fingers bore the scars, his shoulders the weight. But now, after years of toil, he had reached the highest kitchen in the kingdom, and still he did not smile. Today's feast would be magnificent. There would be sugar-glazed venison, surrounded by candied chestnuts and oranges sliced into fans. There would be pies so intricately braided they looked like lace. The centerpiece was a molded jelly, an aspic, shimmering in the torchlight, filled with berries and petals and flecks of gold. A subtlety crowned the table, a sugar sculpture of the royal crest, painted in yolk and wine. It had taken days. Guam oversaw every part. The heat of the ovens, the whipping of cream, the spicing of the sauces. He knew how long to turn the spit. He knew which eggs would separate cleanly. He knew when a cake was done, just by its scent. And yet, when the servants carried the dishes away, he felt nothing. Not pride, not joy, only fatigue. Because Guam knew the truth that followed him like a shadow. None of this was for him. The king would smile. The lords would applaud. Their goblets would clink, and their laughter would echo through the hall. But Guam would remain in the kitchens, wiping his brow, tasting none of it. His dinner would come hours later, if at all. Cold bread, a scrap of meat, perhaps some broth. He had cooked the finest food in the land, and dined like a servant. It wasn't the hunger that hurt the most. It was the distance. He remembered his mother, a weaver. She'd fed him onions fried in lard on feast days, and he'd thought it was magic. She'd never known saffron, never tasted almond milk or roast swan. But she had fed him with tenderness, with hands calloused but kind. Now, in this place of excess, food had become something else. It was not nourishment. It was display. It was power, carved and candied, Guam watched it happen every night. The nobles didn't eat because they were hungry. They ate because they could. He saw them push away half-finished plates, saw meats left to cool untouched, saw desserts sampled once and abandoned. And outside the gates, people starved. He had passed them, children with hollow cheeks, mothers with bent backs, men selling their last boots for bread. He'd seen it, smelled it, hunger like smoke in the streets. And still, he roasted whole stags. He stuffed birds into birds. He glazed pastries with imported figs. The contradiction tore at him. Sometimes, as he stirred a sauce or folded dough, he wondered what it would be like to cook a simple meal. To make a stew that filled a belly, not a throne room. To bake a loaf and hand it to someone who needed it, not someone who judged its crust and found it wanting. But dreams like that didn't belong in royal kitchens. So he cooked, because he was good at it, because he was proud, because a man must do something with his hands, even if it costs him a piece of his heart. There were rumors that he wept once, in the pantry. No one knew why, but perhaps it was after a banquet where the food returned untouched. Perhaps it was after walking past a beggar child who reminded him of himself. Or perhaps it was simply the weight of knowing that he had made beauty, and could not share it. Even so, he returned to the kitchen each day, not because he believed in the feast, but because he believed in the food, in the care it required, in the quiet discipline of shaping chaos into flavor. There was still a kind of holiness in it, even if it lived unseen. Guam never rebelled, never shouted. He kept his sorrow folded like a napkin, tucked away. But when he lifted his ladle, there was something tender in the way he served. A silent prayer for those who would taste what he'd made. A wish, perhaps foolish, that it might reach them more deeply than they knew. He rarely ate with others. He preferred the quiet of the empty kitchen, the warm hush after the fires dimmed, the smells that lingered after the noise had passed. He would sit on a low stool, undo his apron, and stare at the stone walls. His hands would rest in his lap, his breath slow. He never looked up when the nobles toasted his name, because he knew that food, like love, meant more when it was shared. And in this castle, it rarely was. Now let us step back into the winding streets. Let us leave behind the silver platters and golden crusts, and follow a tired spice merchant through the twisting canals of Venice, where flavor traveled thousands of miles, and yet still remained out of reach for most. The spice trade wasn't spicy for everyone. He moved slowly, hunched beneath the weight of the sack on his back. The alleys of Venice were narrow, slick with mist, and layered in the perfume of salt, smoke, and something far more exotic. The man's boots left soft prints in the damp. He was one of many, a porter, a shadow among traders, hired to carry what he could never afford to taste. Inside the burlap sack was treasure. Not gold, not jewels, but cinnamon. Just a few sticks wrapped in oilcloth, fragrant even through layers of cloth. There was also pepper, black and curled like coiled wood, and a small pouch of saffron, lighter than air, worth more than silver. He had no idea what these spices actually tasted like. Not really. He had brushed his fingers across the outside of a cinnamon stick once, inhaling deeply and imagining warm bread or sweetened wine. But in his own home, there was only onion and barley. Salt, if he was lucky. Flavor, when it came from the earth, from smoke, from the pan, not the pouch. Still, he carried them carefully, as if they were sacred. Venice had become this beating heart of the spice trade. Ships arrived from Alexandria and Acre, their bellies filled with sacks of clove, nutmeg, mace, cardamom. They smelled like distant shores, like heat, like mystery. Men with weathered faces and foreign tongues stepped onto the docks, handing over the cargo to merchants in velvet robes. The exchange was quick, quiet, but the impact echoed for miles. Spices did not simply flavor food. They flavored identity. In the courts of Europe, to own pepper was to prove one's status. To scent a roast with cinnamon was to whisper that your wealth stretched beyond borders. Saffron colored stews golden, but it also colored the perception of power. And all of it passed through hands like his. Porters, sailors, apprentices, the invisible spine of the trade. The man who carried the sack would never dine with dukes. He would never taste a stew steeped in clove. But he would haul it, Upstairs, through markets, into kitchens perfumed with garlic and promise. His arms would ache with its weight, and his stomach would growl with the scent it gave off. And yet, he kept going, because there was something enchanting about it. The way a spice so small could travel so far, could shape a dish, could shape a kingdom, even if it never touched his own plate. In the palazzos of the rich, kitchens were transformed, no longer just places of fire and flesh, but of chemistry. Spices were blended like potions. Cooks became alchemists. A single pinch could hide the taste of spoiled meat, could turn the ordinary into legend, could impress a guest enough to change a negotiation. But the costs were steep. Many spices were imported through long, dangerous routes, over deserts, across seas plagued by pirates and storms. The merchants who survived became rich, but the danger traveled too. The ships brought more than clove and cardamom. They brought disease, insects, stories twisted by distance, and sometimes war. And still, the demand grew, because flavor was never just about taste. It was about illusion. A lord who fed guests plain stew was frugal. A lord who served meat laced with cinnamon was divine. There was no in-between. And yet, while nobles debated how much saffron to stir into their custards, most of Europe still ate bland porridge. A peasant might live their whole life without tasting a single spice. Perhaps, on a feast day, a hint of pepper, if they were close to a monastery with connections. But mostly, their food was gray, heavy, rooted in necessity, not delight. The man who carried the sack understood that, and sometimes it hurt. He would see the spices vanish into kitchens, into markets, where glass jars sat high on shelves. He would pass by the perfume of stew and feel something hollow. He would wonder what it all meant, that so many could carry something precious and never hold it. But he never said so. Instead, he did what the city demanded, carried the cinnamon, hauled the pepper, turned away from the smells that followed him home. His wife asked once, just once, what it was like. He had smiled, said nothing. Then the next morning, he returned from the docks with a single peppercorn in his pocket. It was small, dry, and wrinkled. He dropped it into their soup that night, and together they tasted what the rich tasted daily. It was sharp, strange, wonderful. They laughed, and that was enough. The spice trade changed the world. It mapped coastlines. It drew empires. It built palaces. But behind every fortune was a porter with tired feet and a dream of dinner. It is easy now to open a cupboard and find color, flavor, history in a jar. But long ago, flavor traveled in silence, carried on backs, handled by hands that would never dine from gold. And tonight, as we close the markets of Venice, let us wander inland, where snow covers the fields, and a village prepares for Lent, not in celebration, but in scarcity, where fasting becomes not just a choice, but a way of life. Fasting as faith and hunger. The bells rang softly across the frozen fields. It was late winter now, the sky a dull gray that never quite brightened. The soil was hard, the woodpile shrinking. In the village, the people moved slowly, carefully. Their hands were cold, their faces thinner than they had been months before. And Lent had arrived. It came not with celebration, but with surrender. For 40 days, they would fast, not just from meat, but from indulgence, from warmth, from ease. It was a time of repentance, of reflection, a journey into absence, spiritually, yes, but also physically, because the truth was, they were already hungry. In theory, Lent was a sacred ritual, a pause from abundance, a way to turn inward, toward humility, toward God. It was meant to echo the wilderness, the temptation, the discipline of saints and martyrs, a season for the soul. But for most villagers, it was simply timed too well. By February, the salted pork was gone. The stored onions were soft. The dried apples had withered to leather. The butter had turned. What little they had left was rooted in patience. Cabbages, beets, barley, a few shriveled leeks. To fast during Lent was not heroic, it was survival. They had no feast to give up, no luxuries to abandon. They gave up what was already slipping through their fingers. And yet, they kept the ritual. The priest stood in the cold chapel, his robes thin, his voice muffled by the snow drifting through the broken window panes. He spoke of sacrifice, of discipline. He spoke of the soul. But the people only half heard. Their minds were on the stew pot at home, the loaf on the table, the stretch of days ahead. They listened anyway, nodded, crossed themselves. Because Lent was more than hunger. It was tradition, something to hold on to when the firewood ran out. The rules were strict. No meat, no eggs, no dairy, just fish, if you had any. Just bread, if you could grind the grain. Even broth was questionable if it had touched bone. Some broke the rules, quietly. A bit of lard slipped into a pot, a hidden sausage shared between two. The priest looked away. He knew the faces. He knew their children. Others obeyed to the letter. Ate only black bread and leeks, wept from the ache in their bellies, and still believed it was holy. Because suffering, they were told, was sacred. In the manor house above the village, the fast looked different. The Lord's family still ate well, just differently. Fish cooked in wine, almond milk custards, spiced eel. Lent was a shift, not a sacrifice, a change of ingredients, not absence. Their cooks had read the ecclesiastical loopholes. They knew how to simulate cream without cream, meat without meat. They sculpted Lenten meals into illusions, elegant, perfumed, elaborate. But the villagers fasted for real. They chewed slowly, sipped slowly, measured crumbs. Each bite was a decision. And as the days wore on, even the faithful grew faint. Still, there was something comforting in the calendar. It had rhythm. It had meaning. Lent reminded them that the world turned. That spring would come. That hunger was not the end. Each morning, the bells rang again. Each night, a prayer was whispered. The hunger became routine, familiar. And in that quiet ache, some found peace. Children, too young to understand theology, learned what fasting meant before they knew why. They watched their parents make choices, watched meals grow smaller. They learned silence. They learned patience. They learned to dream of Easter. For Easter meant eggs, butter, cheese, meat, color. Even now, the women were setting aside a few eggs carefully, wrapping them in straw, placing them in baskets in the cellar, counting them like treasure, not to eat now, but later, much later, when the bells rang in joy instead of cold. Until then, they boiled their porridge, salted their bread, and fasted. Fasting was not new. It stretched back through centuries, through deserts and monasteries. Saints had done it. Hermits had embraced it. Holy men had starved and claimed visions. But the villagers fasted not for visions. They fasted because winter had no mercy, and because the church asked them to. And perhaps, somewhere between those two reasons, faith was born. In the silence of their kitchens they gave thanks, for the one potato left, for the last onion, for the crust they could dip in broth. They gave thanks for having anything at all. And maybe that was the point. To find holiness, not in abundance, but in just enough. To know that the body, while aching, could still bow. To trust that the land would wake again. By the third week, the children stopped asking for more. The elderly grew quieter. The candles burned low. But Lent was nearing its end. Soon, the snow would melt. The rivers would swell. The first greens would push through frozen earth. Wild garlic, nettle, dandelion, a whisper of life. The hunger would fade, slowly, and the people would feast again. Not like nobles, not like kings, but with boiled eggs and warm bread and something yellow melting on the tongue. And in that meal, they would taste joy, not just because it was sweet, but because they had waited. And as we leave the village behind, we follow the faint sound of distant drums, toward a battlefield, where soldiers fought not just for land, but for rations, and where the difference between life and death sometimes came down to a stale biscuit or a strip of dried meat. A tiny crust, a giant gap. The soldier sat by the dying fire, cradling a crust of bread in his calloused hand. It was hard as stone, speckled with ash, and no larger than his palm. He stared at it for a long time before taking a bite, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. Because in this place, on this frozen field, that crust was more than food. It was survival. The battle had ended 3 days ago. Smoke still curled from distant farms, and the air smelled of iron, sweat, and earth torn apart by boots and hooves. The banners had fallen. The wounded lay in makeshift tents, moaning softly. And the dead, well, the dead had nothing left to need. But the living were hungry. There had been no supply cart, no reinforcements, just dry air and an empty sky. The soldier had searched his pack, pulled apart every seam. One biscuit, a few crumbs of dried meat, and this, his last crust. Others weren't so lucky. Around him, men searched the ground for wild roots. They boiled leather scraps, hoping to soften them into something chewable. They chewed bark, then spit it out. One man tried to eat candle wax. Another fell ill from moldy grain he found in a broken barrel. The hunger made them quiet, not angry, just slow, as though the world itself had softened to a whisper. And yet, far from the battlefield, in castles and manors, untouched by the mud and blood, tables still overflowed. Nobles dined beneath chandeliers, sipped mulled wine, and tore meat from the bone with fingers wrapped in rings. They spoke of war like a game, and ate like it had no cost. But in the mud, among the tents and scattered shields, food became the only thing that mattered. It wasn't about flavor, it wasn't about fullness. It was about energy, warmth, a reason to stand, to keep marching, to swing a sword one more time. That crust of bread? It wasn't just sustenance. It was dignity. It was memory. The soldier remembered his mother's kitchen, the scent of rising dough, the creak of the oven door, the way butter melted slowly, like golden sunlight on warm stone. He remembered laughter, steam on windows, the crackle of firewood. This crust was not that, but it reminded him of what was real, of what still waited somewhere beyond the smoke. He ate slowly. Around him, others did the same, if they could. Those without food watched with hollow eyes, not with envy, but with emptiness. Some whispered prayers before each bite. Others stared ahead, chewing silently, as if tasting something no longer there. There was no shame in hunger here, only distance, because the greatest divide in medieval life wasn't always drawn by swords or titles. It was drawn by food, or the lack of it. The nobleman wore silk and drank claret, but he could also afford pepper, a cook to bake his bread, a servant to fetch his eggs. His hunger was a momentary discomfort, never a condition. He could fast for faith, not because the cupboards were bare. But the soldier, the peasant, the cook without coin, they knew hunger intimately. They slept beside it, dreamed through it. And in war, it grew louder. Armies marched, not just on strategy, but on supply. A well-fed army could win battles before they began. A starving one disbanded in silence. So commanders rationed. They weighed each loaf, cut each strip of dried meat with a knife so thin the soldiers could see through it. Gruel was cooked in barrels, stretched with water, thickened with oats, flavored, if at all, with the memory of salt. Sometimes, a soldier would trade his knife for a piece of cheese, his boots for an onion. And still, the war pressed on. Food became currency. Not coin, not gold, but something far more urgent. One crust, one carrot, one withered pear. It was enough to start a fight, or save a life. Sometimes, after a raid, the soldiers found a farm still standing, a pantry unopened, and for a moment their faces lit up, not with violence, but with hope. The joy of seeing apples in a basket, the tremble of hands reaching for grain. The body needs so little, really. A bit of warmth, a bit of bread. But when even that is denied, the world loses color. The soldier finished his crust. His fingers brushed the last crumbs from his lap. He stared at the fire, now only glowing coals. Around him the camp exhaled in weary sleep. No one stirred. No one spoke. The night held them all in its cold, quiet hands. He closed his eyes, not to dream, but to forget the ache. And somewhere, in a palace far away, a nobleman pushed away his third course, claimed he was full, called for wine instead. Two men, one moment, a crust between them. And as we leave the battlefield behind, let us travel now to a warmer place. A palace where feasts shimmer like gold, where music plays softly behind velvet curtains, and where indulgence reaches such heights it begins to collapse under its own weight. The Royal Feast, a sleepy history of food you'll never taste. In a chamber lit by flickering candlelight and softened by the hush of thick velvet drapes, a feast unfolded. It wasn't just a meal, it was a performance, a slow, shimmering ritual of indulgence. This was the royal table, long as a river, covered in linen white as snow, and crowded with silver platters, golden goblets, and fruits too bright for winter. At its center sat the king. His robe trailed behind him like a shadow stitched in silk. On his plate, a quail stuffed with grapes and chestnuts. To his left, a pie shaped like a castle. To his right, a bowl of figs soaked in wine and scattered with rose petals. His fingers gleamed with fat and sugar. He did not ask where it came from. He only ate. The music drifted. Soft, spiraling strings played by tired hands. Conversation moved slowly, like honey down a spoon. Courtiers whispered behind jeweled fans. A jester turned silent cartwheels near the fire. All eyes stayed near the table. The feast lasted hours. Each dish was an arrival, a surprise, a spectacle. A roasted boar with an apple in its mouth, its hide gilded with gold leaf. A trout arranged to look as if it swam through sprigs of parsley. A tower of custard shaped like flowers. Swans sewn into the shape of beasts. Meat masquerading as fruit. Fruit disguised as meat. It was not food, it was fantasy. A dream served warm. But outside the palace, the night was real. The earth was hard. The village fires burned low. Children lay wrapped in coarse blankets, drifting to sleep on the echo of hunger. The smell of the feast might never reach them, nor its warmth, nor its waste, because this food was never meant to be shared. It was power, plated, a display of abundance so blinding it silenced questions. How many had labored to bring this about? The cook who peeled almonds for hours until his hands shriveled. The boy who polished the goblets until he could see his breath in the reflection. The servant girl who walked 5 miles to fetch milk, only to spill a drop and be scolded. Their hunger was different, not from lack of food, but from watching it pass by. Even those inside the palace, the ones who cooked and cleaned and served, rarely tasted the feast. They stood close enough to smell it, to carry it, to carve it, and then were sent below for scraps. It was always like this. Throughout history, royal feasts were built on distance. The distance between the hand that plucked the grape and the mouth that consumed it. Between the farmer who grew the grain and the noble who broke the bread. Between effort and reward. The palace was not cruel. It was simply indifferent. It had no room for the growl of bellies. It offered spectacle, not sustenance. And so the feast continued. Some lords dined in silence. Others laughed too loudly. One fell asleep in his chair, drunk on claret and comfort. The dessert arrived. A sugar sculpture of the moon, surrounded by candied stars, and filled with soft cream scented with orange blossom. No one finished it. It was too rich, too sweet, too late. And it didn't matter. The point was not to eat everything. The point was that everything was there. That, if they wished, they could summon another moon. Outside, a boy stood in the frost, looking through a gap in the wall. He saw the flicker of candles, the steam rising from platters, the glint of fruit untouched. He could not taste it, but he imagined it. The roast goose, the apple compote, the buttery tarts that broke open like clouds. He did not hate the nobles. He did not envy them. He only wished he could step inside, for one bite, just to know. What does saffron taste like when it's folded into cream? What does a pear become when it's poached in wine? He would never know, but he would remember the smell. And one day, he might tell his children that once, long ago, he stood near a feast made for kings. The palace slept soundly that night, its belly full, its walls thick, its silence deep. The feast had ended. The plates had been cleared, the candles burned low, dripping wax onto linen. The floors creaked only under the feet of servants, sweeping up crumbs too delicate to touch. And still, outside, hunger wandered like a spirit. It had no name, no form, only a question. Who gets to feast? And who gets to serve? These royal tables, grand, glittering, grotesque in their fullness, do not live on in memory because of their flavor. They linger because they remind us what it means to have and to have not. And so the story quiets now. The silver is polished and packed away. The fire dims, the castle exhales. And beyond it, in the soft dark of the fields, a child dreams not of gold or jewels, but of warm bread. Just one loaf, whole and uncut. Not too much to ask, just enough to taste. And now, let your eyes soften with the candlelight as it flickers one last time. Let the scent of imaginary feasts drift gently into sleep, because even in a world of distance, the dream of bread still reaches us all. And it's okay to rest now. There will be food in the morning.